All right, there we go. Front, dim those lights a little bit. All right, welcome back. So it is week 3. Ad drop is done, so now you're trapped. There's no more chance to retreat. It's only moving forward from here on in. Okay, so we were talking last time on Friday. We were talking about some of our generational cohorts and specifically kind of trying to tease out what their lives look like when they were young, right? And especially around some of the technological context that ultimately shape those generations and their experiences as they move into adulthood. And we got through the silents and the baby boomers on Friday, and we are queued up to talk about Gen X today and maybe the millennials. And I started, you won't see it yet because I will, I will put this in once I'm done working on it. I started putting in some stuff on Gen Alpha from some of the preliminary stuff that we have, and it's very, very interesting, to me at least. I hope it'll be interesting to you as well. Okay, I don't know if I answered this question last time, so I'll talk about it very briefly. Okay, so how did generations after the baby boomers become more conservative when we learned about the movements in history of inequality and such? Okay, so this is not, I think this question has somewhat of a false premise. I don't think it's true that generations after baby boomers have become more conservative. We're starting to see a swing starting now, right? Really only in the last few years of particularly men becoming more conservative. And this is a weird, and we'll talk about it later in the course. I have slides on it. This is a weirdly recent phenomenon, and it's one that only seems to be affecting men. Women are becoming far more liberal, and men probably in the last 5 to 10 years have started to become more conservative. But overall, if you look at the generational cohorts, starting with the boomers, they haven't really gotten more conservative, right? If anything, sort of on a whole bunch of questions of values, inclusion and all of these things, they've gotten considerably more liberal in most cases. And the general trend has been towards greater and greater kind of, I would say, progressive kind of ideology with each generation. And it's only now with Gen Z that we're starting to see a kind of a swing back a little bit in the other direction. But again, only specifically among men. Women, not so much. Despite all the trad wife content, on TikTok, women are not generally lining up to have 12 babies and live on a farm. Not that that would be possible anyway. Okay. What is it? Ballerina farms? I keep hearing about ballerina farms, and I could be less interested. Not much, but I could be. Okay, so Gen X. So Generation X coming right after the baby boomers, and this is our generation born kind of, roughly mid-60s. Here, Twingy has the date as 1965, all the way through the end of the 1970s. Very conveniently cutting off right before 1980 to spite my sister. My sister very much hates the idea that she is a millennial. She despises that particular, connotation for her. She's like, no, I'm Gen X. I'm like, not according to most of the people who track this stuff, right? Most people end that generation at 1970, and you're born in 1980, so you're a millennial. Take that. So 1979 is the end of Gen X. Okay, so Gen X is a funny generation, right? In a lot of ways, it's like the silence kind of sandwiched between two really consequential generations and really relatively large cohorts. So one thing that we should note about Gen X, especially as compared to the boomers and the millennials, is as a generational cohort, it's relatively small, right? So it's smaller than the boomers, a lot smaller than the boomers, because birth rates crashed. And it's smaller than the millennials as well. The millennials are a really big cohort simply because they're largely the children of the baby boomers. And the baby boomers being a big cohort generates a big cohort, right? So they're a small cohort, and they're kind of sandwiched between the boomers and the millennials. So they're sometimes a kind of a forgotten generation. People don't think about Gen X as much as they do some of the other generational cohorts. Not because they're not important, but just because they're, less important or less impactful, I guess, than some of the generations that came before and followed. Sometimes, they're also referred to as a sandwich generation. You know how to spell sandwich, I won't write it. Specifically because they're sort of, stuck between kind of their younger silence and older boomers as parents, and then having, relatively young children at the same time, which has meant that in a lot of cases they've faced a sort of care crunch, right? Caring for aging parents and, children and teenagers at the same time. So having a lot of economic kind of strain on their shoulders. Okay, so what do we know about Gen X? So Gen X, they are the first generational cohort to have lived entirely in the television era, right? Some of the older boomers would at least remember when television sort of came into the market. Younger boomers won't. But Gen X lived entirely during the television era. And they're sometimes referred to as the last analog rather than digital generation, right? So they grow up entirely, essentially, before the internet becomes a mainstream part of everyday life, right? So roughly speaking, we get wide commercial availability of the internet in 1995, right? So by then, you've already got Gen Xers, the youngest part of Gen X is already kind of into their mid to late teens. So they're experiencing the internet coming into kind of, everyday life, but they're already in high school, right? And its impact isn't quite as big as it's going to be for the millennials, for whom, it comes when they're quite a bit younger. So most of Gen X grows up in a time prior to digital technology really kind of taking everything over, right? So they're different than that, and sometimes referred to as that last analog generation. And you'll hear, from Gen Xers that, in childhood, their parents had them play outside for long periods of time, right? Sent them outside. They would wander the neighborhood with other neighborhood kids from, dawn till dusk, showing up only for lunch and for snacks occasionally, right? And that this was sort of a normal part of the Gen X sort of life, right? That's kind of just how they lived. Okay, in the US, they were the first generation to live post-abolition of the draft, right? So basically, the US, after the Vietnam War, shifted from a conscript army to an all-volunteer army. So all the people who are in the military are ultimately there because they signed up. So there's no forced military service for Gen X. So fewer of them serve in the military than the prior generational cohorts. Okay, they also, I guess when it comes to TV, they still mostly live, in the pre-cable era. And certainly, they're still alive, but they grow up prior to streaming for sure, but even most of them don't have cable. And so, they live in what's called the 3-network era. Maybe the 4-network, depending on where they live. So that, you have television, but it's mostly broadcast, right? So it's mostly over-the-air broadcast, which means like in the US, they get, ABC, CBS, NBC, I know there was another one, and a little bit later, maybe Fox. Television, not Fox News, right? So 4 channels. In Canada, right, it's CBC, CTV, and eventually what will become global, but, it's not global until the 90s. But let's just, for simplicity's sake, say global, Right, so they have, we essentially had 3 stations unless you had cable. Okay, so what this leads to is a culture amongst Gen Xers that is a lot less fragmented, right? So a lot of shared cultural touchstones for this generation. Largely, right, people who are watching the same programming, listening to the same music on radio, watching the same television shows on the very few stations, that kind of fit this, that were available. And so, there was a really strong shared culture, which sort of starts to break apart towards the end of Gen X's time because of cable TV. And so, I'm a little bit later than this, right? So I'm born in 1982. But I still, sort of in one of those like transitional between generation moments in a sense. Sometimes, people born in the late 70s, early 80s are called Zennials, colloquially, not really an academic term, because we're kind of Gen X millennial at the same time. But I remember, right, like what my experience of like junior high and high school is every Monday morning, coming and chatting with my friend about the most recent episode of things like The Simpsons or Family Guy that aired on Fox. Because we had these shared cultural touchstones that we were all watching the same things at the same time, and it was all, the new episode came out on a particular day. It wasn't like today where it's just like they dump all the content and there's nothing to talk about because none of your friends are watching the same thing. So a lot less cultural fragmentation, so a lot more shared culture, right? And that's really hard now. I teach a media class in the fall, critical media studies, so it's 444, and finding, kind of shared touchstones for Gen Z is really hard because you all watch very different things, right? You have these very tailored media environments. Okay, this is our first generation to grow up with video games, right? And especially video games at home, right? So this is the generation that first gets home consoles like the Nintendo Entertainment System, and then the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or the SNES, Sega Genesis, and then PlayStation, right? These are staples of Gen Xers, and become especially the earlier ones like the Nintendo Entertainment System, and the Game Boy. Oh my, the Game Boy. So many hours lost to the Game Boy amongst my generation, or that generation. I guess I'm technically not Gen X. What great things they could have accomplished were it not for the Game Boy. So, right, video games in kind of at-home and consumable form become really, really important, and later generations it'll be even more important. Okay, I'm going to erase all these doodles because I have nowhere else to write. Okay, so, whoops, what did I do? This is intriguing. I made a magnifying glass. There it is. I can make things bigger. I've mastered this technology now. Okay, maybe not mastered. Okay, so other things happening that are really interesting and important for this generation, right? Because of changes in the adjudication of divorce, right, in both the US and Canada, and there are different rates in different places, they experience pretty high rates of divorce in their silent and older boomer parents, right? So in Canada, for example, in Canada, right, we get the Divorce Act of 1968, which makes it much easier to get divorced, and subsequent changes in that act in 1985, which makes it way easier to get divorced, right? And people do take advantage of this. Couples that would have stayed together in the past split up because it becomes so much easier to do so. In the US, there's similar kind of trends, although it's much more at the state level. No-fault divorce gets passed in certain places much earlier, places like Oregon, Washington, California. Functional no-fault divorce laws get passed in places like New York pretty early as well, but then, it's different in different parts of the country. Okay, so when they say, those 50% of marriages ended in divorce, and the kids, had to deal with the fallout of that, that really starts with Gen X. It carries through as an experience for the millennials and Gen Z. as well. But Gen X is really the first generation to experience that in a major way because it becomes a legal and economic possibility. All right, they're the first, and I'm going to say, I'm going to put an asterisk near last, of the latchkey kids, right? So latchkey kids, this was a term that was bandied around, especially in the 80s and 90s, essentially for children with two working parents, right? So, and especially, with moms that worked, because the assumption was always that dad is going to be working, but moms that were working. And so what happened and why they were called latchkey kids is because, they would come home from school on their own, unlock the door, right? They had a key, and often from like first grade onward, unlock the door, let themselves into the house and just kind of wait at home until their parents got home, right? And this is a very normal experience for Gen X kids didn't really have childcare in lots of cases. They just went home and let themselves in and had a snack and turned on the TV, and there were after-school TV programs on, classic stations like YTV, Channel 14 in Edmonton. And you just rotted your brain watching TV until your parents got home and made dinner and you got on with your day. They were terrible times. Magical. Everything was magical. Okay, so that's the latchkey kids, right? Now what happens subsequently, and why I say the last of them, sort of, because there's definitely still kids for whom this is the reality, but for a lot more kids, right? And there was a lot of panics about latchkey kids, both on a moral level, right? I remember especially sort of, Christian conservatives decrying latchkey kids as a kind of scandal or a social problem created by working mothers. In particular, that definitely happened. But also there's a bunch of moral panics around child safety, and it leads to the creation of a lot of out-of-school care and after-school care programs that frankly just didn't exist in the 80s and the 90s, and even in the early 2000s, they were much rarer. So you have fewer kids. You have many fewer kids, basically, that have this level of independence this early. And, keep that in mind. We're going to talk about this again towards the end of the course, because this is something that scholars like Jonathan Haidt end up sort of decrying, right? The loss of independence that comes with much more supervision, a movement that he calls safetyism. And he kind of thinks it ruined kids in a lot of ways and made everybody way, way more anxious. Okay, so there are still obviously kids for whom this is the normal experience, but in the following decades, right, you do get a lot more after-school care programs and much more kind of strict controls on kids and much more supervision. Again, driven by a whole bunch of things. Partially. Maybe I could go to the next. Hang on, let me see if there's any questions. How was my dad's birthday? Well, we celebrated yesterday because they didn't want to do it. My parents went out for dinner on Friday, so we had Chinese food yesterday. It was great. It was lovely. 79, still pretty spry, all things considered. Yes. Could I re-say why Gen X is a smaller generation? Largely it's just because kind of at the tail end of the silence having kids and that beginning part of the boomer cohort that are the parents of Gen X, they just had way fewer children, right? The birth rate drops considerably. Hang on, I'm going to write something because I like writing on slides, right? 1972 in Canada, I think it's 1976 in the US, but I could be wrong about that, is the year that fertility rates, right? Remember we talked about TFR last class. So fertility rate in Canada in 1972 falls below replacement. Now, if you're ever wondering, it never recovers, right? 1972 or 1971 is the last year in which Canada hit replacement fertility. Everything since then, in terms of population growth, has largely been driven by immigration. So there's no replacement fertility after that, which means your generational cohorts tend to be kind of small. And so the Gen X is quite a small cohort. People just had fewer kids. There's also some economic things in the 70s, which we'll get to a little later. But the 70s is not a great time economically. We get some major economic headwinds in 1973, which basically crashes the economy until well into the 1980s, right? And so what happens when people have, economic headwinds? They tend to have fewer kids, right? It's harder to find a job, harder to launch into adulthood. And so one of the things that tends to happen is words are hard on Mondays, is that people put off or actually decide not to have children because they feel like they can't afford them, right? And there's a lot of other things too, right? More contraception, more women staying in the workplace more actively, which drops fertility rates as well. But all of this leads to a relatively small cohort. And then conditions get a little bit better in the 80s. So the boomers that were going to have kids then sort of have more kids, not a ton more, still not enough to get us to replacement fertility, but there's such a big cohort that it makes a big cohort of millennials, right? Okay. Huzzah. Did I answer the questions? I don't know. Would I say the rise of stranger danger and satanic panic is a large generational event for boomers, Gen X? Yes. I mean, I'm not as convinced on the satanic panic, to be honest. I mean, there's definitely, this is like a moral panic from, I believe, the 80s, but definitely a kind of sense that the world is a more dangerous place. And especially, and again, we'll get back to this when we get later in the course. One of the things that happens is people become convinced in the 1980s that their kids are just unsafe, like on a daily basis. And there's some high profile incidents where children are like abducted off the street and disappear, right? We had one in Edmonton back in the 80s. I think her name was Corrine, nicknamed Punky Gustafson. And she disappeared. We still have no idea what happened to her, right? Never found, no trace of her, sadly. But then parents are like, oh my gosh, stranger kidnap is a huge problem. There might be someone driving around in a white van right now, just randomly kidnapping kids off the street. It's largely sort of a misunderstanding and a media-driven panic because, most kids who get kidnapped are not kidnapped by strangers. They're kidnapped by an estranged parent. That's most typical, or a relative of some kind. A stranger kidnap is relatively rare, but it changes people's behavior enough that they start to strip freedoms away from their kids. And, largely are like, well, screens are safe. Let's have them know. And we'll never get over the fact that pedophiles were all over Club Penguin. I will die on that hill. I don't know why. Okay, so in terms of social values, oh my, 25 minutes goes by quickly when we're talking about Gen X. In terms of social values, some of the changes in kind of sexual morality that we saw start with the boomers continues on with Gen X, right? So Twenge sort of, her header in her chapter on Gen X is marriage, sex, and children, not necessarily in that order. So, sorry, that should be in flexibility in sex lives and family life, right? So the order of that things happen in for Gen X becomes a little bit different, right? And what Twenge notes is that they have a shorter childhood, but a much longer adolescence. What happens with Gen X is, in particular, they become sexually active and kind of sexually engaged at much earlier ages. And like really, really, I don't want to say strange, interesting kind of social phenomenon, right? Marriage gets pushed off. Freaking Mondays, man. Marriage gets pushed off later, right? So they marry later than any previous generation. The average age at first marriage, why do you keep cutting out on me, microphone? The average age at first marriage for women climbs to about 25. And you remember, right, we talked about 2 generations back, the science, it was 20.1. It climbs up to about 25 for women and 27 for men. And the gap between things like, basically losing your virginity if you're a woman and getting married is much longer for Gen X, right? So early boomer women had sex only about 2 years before they got married. So don't ever let the boomers tell you they did things differently. They didn't. It's all lies. Gen X women went 7 years between losing their virginity and walking down the aisle. So the gap between becoming sexually active and, getting married got quite a bit longer, by about 5 years for women. And yeah, children and marriage just gets uncoupled with the Gen Xers, right? In 1960, 1 in 20 children were born to unwed mothers. By 1980, right, it's 1 in 6. That's largely a bunch of boomers as well. But, you're starting to see Gen X in there. And 1 in 3 by 1993. And interestingly, and this is where, things change quite a bit, the age of a mother at birth of first child dipped below the age of first marriage for the first time, which, is this kind of social revolution in a sense, right? There's a complete uncoupling of marriage and having children in Gen X. Now, I will say, part of this also leads to some of that safetyism because Gen X, has a, shall we say, disproportionate number of teen pregnancies, a lot of which is attributed to that latchkey phenomenon, right? And I mean, it's generally a truism that teenagers left unsupervised will get into trouble, right? So the more unsupervised time they have, the more chance they have to do things like take drugs, commit crimes, and have sex. And Gen X had a lot of unsupervised time, and so they got sexually active considerably earlier, and there's some decent percentage of teen pregnancies that followed from that, right? So a lot of the 90s was spent battling the teen pregnancy epidemic. Now, what nobody knew at the time was all you needed was a show called 16 and Pregnant on MTV, showing 16-year-old girls what it would be like to be a teenage mother, and that would all go away. And I'm not kidding. After that show aired, teen birth rates in the US dropped considerably. So, but there's a lot of effort on after-school specials about, safe sex and all of that stuff for Gen Xers and millennials, basically because of this last point. Okay. So, Gen X, what to say about them? We talked a little bit about how, embracing kind of the self-help movement was something that we saw a little bit with the boomers, right? After they get through the rebellious years, they go into a lot of self-help. And this doesn't stop with the boomers, right? It carries through with Gen X. In some sense, gets kind of amplified. Loving yourself and self-help become major trends with Gen X, driven by things like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and Sesame Street. Kids during this generation are taught that self-esteem is paramount, right? And that you're a beautiful, wonderful, perfect person just the way you are, right? Which is true. You're all wonderful. And, I'm always blown away by this one. In the 1950s, 12% of teens agreed with the statement. I am an important person, okay? By the late 80s, 80% of teens claimed that they were important, right? So you see that there's a definite movement towards self-esteem, self-help, and self-empowerment that has major effects on the perception of people, right? So this is a use of the word self-focus and self-esteem in American books, 1950 to 2019. And what you see, right, is there's not that much of it in 1950, but it rises steadily, kind of hitting not quite its peak, but close to its peak, well, for self-esteem, just as the last Gen Xers are turning 18, and then self-focus, really keeps climbing all through the years, that the millennials are coming about. So I don't know if that explains the millennials in some way. I guess we'll find out. Okay, I answered these. I cleared them. Why are they still here? I'm so angry. No, I'm not. Okay, materialism. Gen X, right? You could quote a Madonna song and say, living in a material world, and I am a material girl. That's Madonna, a kind of Gen X icon, Gen X is really a sort of culmination, at least up till that point, of growing trends towards a sort of unabashed materialism. Now, I want to say again that this is, again, the boomers' kind of values continuing on from them to Gen X, right? It's not like Gen X suddenly decided materialism was important to them. Not at all, right? This is something that started well before they come into the world, and they're just like picking up on the end of that cultural kind of pathway. That said, material wealth is very important to Gen Xers as a whole. So life goals shift from intrinsic things like meaning, ideas, helping others, community, to extrinsic ones like money, fame, and image, right? So what do we see? College students in Gen X were much less likely than prior generations to say that they were in college to develop a meaningful philosophy of life, and much more likely, let's have fun with highlighters again, to say that they were there to become well off financially. And honestly, this trend has accelerated and continued with our millennials and Gen Z. But here we kind of see, right, percent of US incoming students, and this is one of these great long-term surveys that they have in the US that I wish we had here. The American Freshman Survey, right, where they survey people coming into college, and the data here is from 1966 to 1997, but it's continued on beyond that. And you see, right, somewhere around 1970, being well off financially just as a reason for going to college starts shooting up. And it kind of hits its apogee more or less when Gen X is in college, right? So it goes up a little bit, but the big climb was prior to Gen X coming into the market. And what do we see? You know, developing a meaningful philosophy of life. It used to be, right, that 85 or 86% of college freshmen said that they were going to college to develop a meaningful, philosophy of life. And by the time, we hit the end of Gen X or even the beginning of Gen X, we've shaved 40 points off of that, right? So there's a big shift in why people go to college. And when we talk about education, we'll talk about that again. But, it being just a credential aimed at getting a good job definitely starts to hit. Now, ultimately, that will have big effects on the kinds of education that people pursue. When people cry about things like the death of the social sciences and humanities, unfortunately, at least for me, I have to tell them that, this was baked into the cake a long time ago. By the time we hit the mid-1970s, right, the kind of cultural forces that lead to the decline of the social sciences and humanities are already baked in and they're already playing out, right? But again, we can talk about this a little bit more as we get further. But yeah, there's definitely a push into things like science, technology, engineering, math, our STEM fields, as the way to make money, and of course, business and finance, because you want university and college to be about getting you forward in life. Okay. So, the general trend for Gen X was worse mental health as teens, along with, one of these things, a nearly double rate of teen suicides compared with the boomers, right? Generally, though, as they entered adulthood, that kind of evened out for them, right? Their mental health seems to have gotten considerably better as they aged into adulthood. Their markers of anxiety, depression, all that stuff sort of evened off, and their suicide rates dropped back to kind of historical averages. And what Twenge notes is that that high rate of suicide probably coincides with the deregulation in the States of gun laws. So guns became far more available when, just as Gen X was quite young, more types and just a proliferation of gun ownership. And one of the unfortunate truths is that suicide attempts that begin with a gun are far more likely to be successful. So what probably happened, there's just more guns floating around. Gun safety's not great. And so these extra guns lead to more successful youth suicides. Kids that in other states might have been listed as a self-harm event, where they are hospitalized and then they get released and they get mental health treatment with guns available. That unfortunately doesn't happen. Okay. Now this is where, then we get to the millennials. It's a whole other bag of worms. Okay, so Gen X is at the beginning of, and again, I want to stress here that what happens with Gen X carries and starts with Gen X very much carries through to the millennials and Gen Z, right? And I think a lot of what we're seeing ultimately in the experience of Gen Z, we'll talk about it as we go forward, but a lot of loneliness, anxiety, social disconnection begins with these things in Gen X, which is a decline in social trust. Okay. And as Twenge notes, social fabric generally sort of breaks down when trust is low. And what we see in Gen X is a sort of decline in a bunch of markers of social trust, right? Let's see if I can do this now. I had the magnifying glass, but how did I access it? No, it's lost. What is the dot? I want how did I get the magnifying glass? I don't know. It's mysterious. Oh, there it is. Haha. Let's go up to here. Now I've broken everything. There we go. Okay. So there we go. So our first chart here, right? So percentage of 12th graders expressing trust in others, right? And so this is, our period where Gen X, that gray part is that period where Gen X is young, right? So what do we have? We have, a belief that people are helpful, that you trust other people, and that other people are fair, all kind of take a nosedive, right? During that period where Gen X is young. So declining trust in other people. When we talk about, these are government institutions, right? We see not as steep a decline, but we still kind of see declines, especially in this one, which whoever thought that was true. People running the government are honest, right? That one takes a nosedive when Gen X is young. This is probably largely driven, at least in part, by the impeachment of Richard Nixon, right? So Nixon very famously, commits crimes, and he would have been impeached and kicked out of the presidency had he not resigned. But it sort of taints the office of the president with a very negative, label. You get later scandals right through the 90s of people like Bill Clinton. Clinton's, shall we say, indiscretions aren't quite the level of Nixon's. He just is stooping a White House intern named Monica Lewinsky. But it's the talk, I remember this because it was intolerable at the time, but it's the talk of the town, the white stain on her blue dress, if you can follow that, and people want genetic testing on it, and it's just a mess for years, right? So trust in government declines generally, right? You see people trust the government less at the top there. Government run for the people versus big interest. People start losing the sense that the government is for them. And again, you see that those trends continue on after Gen X. Those trends begin with Gen X. And people running the government are honest. It tanks during Gen X, but that trend definitely continues. Okay, I like this zoomy thing. Otherwise, these charts are very hard to see. Okay, and one of the other things that Twenge notes is that one of the things that we see with Gen X is increasing income inequality, right? And that goes along with a growing lack of trust in social institutions, right? So if we go back to when the boomers were young and coming into the workforce, they were living in a period, like I said last time, of quite substantial equality, right? The gap between the richest and poorest in society is as small as it's ever going to be. Workers are doing really, really well. From the time the Gen Xers are young, the gap between the richest and the average gets bigger and bigger, right? And along with that, we get growing levels of lack of trust in society. Back to, there we go. I like this. I don't know how I did it. I'm sure I'll figure it out. Okay. The millennials. My friends. All right, so the millennials. The millennials. So that is our cohort, 1980 to 1995. All right, so thinking again on our technology model of social change, right? Most of the millennials grow up with the internet as a pervasive part of their lives, right? So, like I said, 1995 is sort of held up as the year that internet access becomes a generally available commodity, right? That you can buy, access initially through dial-up, but eventually through cable and other means to the internet, right? And it kind of explodes. Every school gets internet access, right? It becomes something you have to have. Kind of like AI now, like everybody's like raving about AI. Back in the 90s, it was the internet, right? We all have to get connected to the internet. We will get the internet, ... perfect future. Nobody quite knew what the 3 dots were, and I'm not sure anyone ever figured it out. But, there you go. Kind of like AI, right? Everyone's like, hey, we'll use AI and ... utopia. Or the Terminator movies. One or the other. I don't know which. Okay. So most of the millennials grow up, right? So your oldest millennials are about 15 when the internet hits. But the bulk of that cohort, right, is going to be below 10 years old. So the internet becomes a pervasive part of their childhood and emerging adult years. So millennials were sometimes, I don't know if they still say this, referred to as either the first digital generation or the first digital natives, right? A generation that, didn't have to, migrate into digital life, but actually sort of came from that world naturally. Millennials are definitely the first to experience social media, though mostly as young adults, right? I was when Facebook really hit, I had just finished university, right? So I was just in my, just basically finished my undergrad degree and was living out on my own when Facebook really hit, followed by, Twitter and then Instagram and all of these other things. So we mostly experienced it as kind of young adults, but we're definitely the first generation that, experiences social media. Highly, highly educated generation. 1 in 3 millennials have a 4-year college degree in the US, and that number is similar in Canada. So really educated, lots of university and college completion, and actually, earning more on average by 2019 than the 3 previous generations did at the same points in their lives. And we'll talk about this probably next class. Millennials like to whine and complain a lot that life is so much harder for millennials, right? They have less income or less wealth than other generations did at the same points. But broadly, by 2019, right, they were earning more and their wealth was growing and catching up to Gen X and the boomers in major ways. So they're doing fine. We'll talk about it, but they don't think they're doing fine, which is an interesting thing, which we'll talk about next class. Millennials on the whole, right, have fewer children than boomers or Gen X, and they started having children considerably later than either. So one of the things that has happened, they have an even longer period of what you might call extended adolescence or emerging adulthood than other generations did, and have had, on the whole, through their lives, more disposable income because their wages are higher owing to being more educated and having better jobs, and fewer kids to spend that money on. Okay, 34% less wealth than previous generations at the same age in 2016, but they closed that gap significantly by 2019. And by 2025, they're essentially on par with where past generations were. They just started later because they went to school for longer, right? Because an undergrad education became the norm for millennials. 1 in 3 get an undergrad education. And I mean, if you count 2-year college certificates, it's an even higher number. It rises to about 2/3 that have some kind of post-secondary education. Okay. The slide on self-help makes you cry happy tears. Does the freshman graph correlate with rising expenses and tuition? That's an interesting question. How come after being impeached, Trump was able to run for office again? Because he wasn't convicted for some reason. History will puzzle that one out for years. Okay, so the freshman one. Oh, zoom. I can't zoom. I lost my magnifying glass, friend. Okay. Yeah, so the freshman one, sorry, this one. I'm assuming it's this one you're talking, or maybe, was it this one? Oh, I mean, yeah, you're going to have some, but the bulk of the actual rise in tuitions comes principally in the 2000s and the 2010s. There's other things that lead to that, but yeah, it's a good question, but I don't think it's that severe. The slide on self-help makes you cry happy tears. Okay. All right. So how am I doing for time? 2 minutes. I could do this slide in 2 minutes. We can talk about millennials as a slightly diluted generation. Millennials are not actually poor, despite caterwauling rather loudly that they are. They're a super consumerist generation that buys a lot of crap, mostly on Amazon. Trust me, I know. I am these people. I know who we are. There is, however, a pretty high cost of living, right? Millennials do live through one of the probably more unfortunate kind of social problems that comes, which is the explosion in the price of housing. Some of them benefit, especially the older part of the millennial cohort, but a lot of them, find it's very, very hard to keep up. And post-COVID, right, the explosion in the cost of living hits millennials pretty hard. Some of them have higher college debt, right? Obviously, more of them go to college, so more of them acquire debt. However, it's a very small percentage of extremely educated millennials that hold the bulk of the college debt. It's people who get masters and PhDs principally that hold most of the college debt. So it's a relatively, and for most people, those undergrad debts are relatively manageable. They do, however, and I'm conscious of the time, have sky high expectations of what their lives are going to look like, in large part because they sort of internalize that the pretty affluent lifestyles that the boomers had when, having already worked 20 to 25 years, by the time millennials were kind of aware of it, right? 2 cars, an RV, maybe a recreational property is the norm. And so they often feel like they are falling behind and can't meet the, what other generations had or what their peers had. And social media seems to play a role in this as well. Comparison culture really finds its way into the world, right? All of a sudden, it becomes possible for you to, shall we say, compare your lifestyle to that girl, Sandra, you went to elementary school with, right, who posts pictures on Instagram and Facebook, who for some reason you follow, and she only posts the good stuff about her Mexican vacation. But everybody, kind of is like, oh man, all of these people, I see all of these great things they're doing, and I'm not doing those things, and so they get jealous. Okay, we'll leave it here with the Kardashians for some reason. We're going to keep going, and hopefully we'll get through Gen Z on Tuesday. I got lots to say about the millennials, but we'll keep going. Whew.